First of all, I'd like to welcome everyone back here to this plenary session today in this conference. My name is Katja Green. I'm Dean of Faculty at KTH, and I'm Professor of Critical Studies in Architecture here at the Architecture School. And I've been asked by Vanya to chair this session, and we will get to hear here two longer papers by Professors Anastasia Lukatou-Sideris and Mahesh Nalla. Before we get into those papers, and those papers I would like to stress really stand for the real topical content of this session. Vanya asked me to say a few words on the research and education at KTH in architecture and gender, architecture and feminism, which I, together with my colleagues here at KTH, have had the luxury of setting up over the last decade. So this, oh, you're starting at the wrong slide. You should. Okay. Sorry, I'll just make sure we. I think you pointed there. Can I do it from the computer? Now, hopefully, it should work. Okay, so I have a series of slides here that will run in the background, and they give you some ideas of our work and initiatives in teaching and research here at KTH. Our history, in short. In 2007, together with 4 colleagues here at KTH, I formed the group FATAL, Feminist Architecture Theory, Analysis, Laboratory, Education. We were keen to engage and alter the conditions and forms of practice, education, and research in architecture. In the same year, 2007, Critical Studies in Architecture was introduced as an academic subject at KTH, and I held the first faculty position in this subject. The teaching opportunities that we, I would say, both formed and received, it gave us the possibility to build courses and a curricula engaging both in developing and articulating feminist perspectives on architecture as a discipline, as well as feminist design education methods. And for those of you who are less familiar with architecture schools, architecture education, I should also say that the opportunity to build and to be influencing in architectural education around feminist perspectives is something that is not and cannot be taken for granted. But it's happening in different parts of the world, in different universities at certain cycles. It's coming and going. So, and you who are more familiar with architecture field might recognize this. So what is feminist to architecture, or architecture to feminism? How does gender matter in the discipline and profession of architecture? I'm sure you have in this conference a lot of thoughts and deeper perspectives on this. And there is, of course, no short answer to that course. What I wanted to give here in these few minutes is a few angles that are and have become very important to our teaching and research. The first one, maybe the very obvious, but also very foundational. Architecture as the idea of architecture as a profession, as a discipline, is in a popular mind made up very much of great buildings, and great architects. We know how complicated in reality that architectural practice is. Buildings and their name architects still make up our idea of architecture to a large degree. And as a consequence, the architects that are most visible in history and today are mostly men. It's a classical reproduction of male authorship and genius which is at play when our idea of architecture is formed. And this is reproduced in magazines, in history writing, and in education. And this condition needs to be constantly challenged. And this is not something that is all evident all across the field in our architectural education. It's something that still needs to be constantly reminded of. Number 2, architecture is art and technology. With technology comes, among other things, the potential for setting up large generalizing systems, of reproducing spatial types and standardized norms, fitting to ways of living and inhabiting the structures that architects design. And from feminist perspectives, we learn to challenge those norms and to question the technology of generalizing systems. In that sense, feminist studies, feminist theories become important tools. Number 3, architecture comes with great power. Power to shape people's lives, opening and closing spatial opportunities. Feminist studies here teaches us to analyze and challenge that power, to dismount the expert's role and shift perspective to other actors. And thus, in our pedagogy, to actively work with positioning, with understanding your role, with shifting roles, has become an important part. 4, architecture is formed around the people who are foregrounded. These spaces may be heavily gendered. It may be heavily gendered, for example, by sheer male dominance in some cases, or by discursive and behavioral norms that are cut in stone by generations of such dominance. We can think, for example, of a technical faculty at a university. And in that context, in a context with deeply ingrained gender norms, to set up alternative spaces, to consciously shift and break the space, to use furniture arrangement, atmosphere, to support a shifting of perspective, to give room for other voices, is also an important area of exploration for us, establishing alternative spaces. So, those 4 perspectives. I would like to just end by mentioning some of my colleagues who have been most heavily engaged over the years to forming our architecture feminist context at KTH. Hélène Frichot, Michael Schalk, Brady Burrows, Katarina Bonnevier, and recent doctors now, Helen Runting and Sepidi Karami. And of course, there are many more names. So please, if you're curious and interested in knowing more about what we do, contact me, and I can refer you to any of my colleagues to understand more about the most recent research and education ventures. And this was a little bit of an odd introduction, but it was asked by Vanya to do this and to say something about the architecture and feminist context here at KTH. So now, thank you for listening. I should also say this is the last slide. This is some important publications in the field. To the left, we have a set of publications coming out of the KTH context. So, now we can move to our next presenter. And we can change the presentation. So, it's time for Professor Anastasia Lokati-Cedar.
Vanya, first and foremost, for inviting me yet again. It's one of my favorite cities, Stockholm. So it's great to be here. The title is a little bit different from what is written on the program, because I try to more accurately represent what this talk is about. I want to talk about transit crime, the built environment, and gender differences. It really captures my work on this particular topic in the last 10 years or so, or even more, actually from the 1990s. And let me see, so I'm moving it by, how do I move?
You did move.
No, I didn't move. I had a...
We're not going to go too far if we can't.
Should I use it? Just a second. Yesterday it happened. I can move for you.
You can? Okay, it works from the computer?
Yes.
Okay. So yesterday, actually, Vanya mentioned that safety is a right, should be considered as a right, and I very much agree with that. I would also say that mobility, physical mobility, which is the ability to move from one place to another quite smoothly, quite quickly, without obstacles, should also be considered an important citizen right. It is related to the accessibility, which is the ability to take advantage of the different amenities that we have in cities, the parks, the open spaces, the markets, the schools, and as well as to richer jobs and economic opportunities. So these are important rights, but sometimes these are compromised if we have transit crime. And transit crime is something that happens, as we see in this conference, in different cities. It affects different riders differently, and I have to be looking, okay, great. And it scares and intimidates some riders. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so now it's working. Okay, oops, it's not showing. Okay, here, sorry, we have all these technical issues. So there are two things that my presentation today would like to address, drawing from my work from the past. The first, probably I would say, my first body of work on the issues of transit crime really looked into the question and the relationship between the design of the built environment, the physical characteristics of place, and transit crime, and asking how should we try to design and plan differently. But my more recent work is more interested in what I call vulnerable users, and I'm concentrating on issues of gender and how it affects mobility, and even more recently on issues of age and income and how it affects mobility. So the outline of my talk is as follows. I'm going to talk a little bit about transit crime and place characteristics, giving you a little bit of the theoretical background, and then I will turn to some of my empirical studies about transit crime in Los Angeles. And the second part of my talk, I'm going to talk more specifically about women and mobility and gender differences in travel patterns and some findings from empirical studies in the US. And I'm going to mostly leave the policy recommendations for the end of the day today because we don't have much time in this session. So the theoretical background of the work on built environment on crime comes in the form of criminological theories, and we have two basic types. We have ecological theories that really stress the importance of physical and ecological attributes and study the environmental context of crime, what the Brantinghams called the backcloth of crime. And we also have compositional theories that look into the importance of sociodemographic attributes, age, ethnicity, gender, class, social mobility, and they mostly study the offenders. And the two types of theories lead to a number of crime prevention strategies. The ecological theories, they really target the environmental context and try to design out crime. We have a lot of work by criminologists on situational crime prevention, and of course the theories of crime prevention through environmental design. The compositional theories that look into potential offenders, they look into social and educational services, they examine policing strategies and criminal justice strategies. So a stream of research that is concerned with identifying the physical factors that form the environmental backcloth of crime and what kind of particular attributes of place may generate opportunities for crime are under this whole rubric of environment and crime. And that's where my own work falls into, where the studies of streets, of alleys, of bid-block connections that may represent escape routes, the study of land uses, and what I call negative land uses, such as liquor stores, bars, pawn shops, sometimes ATM machines, adult bookstores and theaters, their proximity to which bus stops. Some scholars, including myself, have shown that relates to transit crime. Physical disrepair and deterioration, the well-known broken window hypothesis, the physical and social incivilities and their relationship to crime, the natural surveillance opportunities that particular sites allow, and the Jane Jacobs, very well-known, eyes on the street, and even a subset of studies that really look specifically into density and how it relates to crime. And we have the development of environmental criminology in the late 1980s and 1990s that really inquires very specifically about these issues. And I would say that up to the 1990s, many studies did not show exactly which environmental variables affect what types of crime. I mean, when we talk about crime in general, we have very different crimes. We have crimes like rape, that we heard a very interesting presentation by Vanya today, very, very different from pickpockets, for example, very different from sexual offense crimes. Each type of crime requires different environmental characteristics. It is more common under different environmental characteristics. Also, few studies had measured up to that time the physical environment directly and objectively. They were mostly focusing on subjective perception surveys. So here's a map, a GIS map from some of my earlier work that really looked into bus stops. And a lot of the common knowledge was that, of course, you have a lot of bus stop crime in unsafe neighborhoods. But this was not explaining, in my mind, why on the same bus route, a bus stop that was just a few feet, 100 feet away from, how do we get this again? Yep. From another one would be completely with no crime incidents, and another would have a lot of crime. And of course, as we know now, the answer comes into some of the micro elements, the microenvironment of crime. So I undertook a very serious investigation of measuring, trying to objectively measure different aspects of the built environment. How close this bus stop was to open front establishments, how close it was to different alleyways, what was the lighting in each of these bus stops, and running a number of regression analysis. I will tell you a little bit about the results. This is another study of a metro rail line, and actually this was a new line in Los Angeles, the Green Line that had opened at the time in the mid-1990s, and the line was passing through some very high crime areas in the city and ending in the suburbs, in the affluent suburbs. And there was a lot of opposition at the time from suburbanites because they were afraid that it was going to bring crime to the suburbs. And we really had the opportunity to measure the effects of the line, and we found that no crime was not transported to the suburbs. And actually, it was very interesting, the presentation yesterday of rape that showed that it is quite rare that criminals are going to go very far away from their neighborhood. So the expectation that people are going to get on the line and travel to the suburbs, going to burglarize, and then get on the line and come back to their neighborhood was absolutely not true. So the unit of analysis in these studies was both the place and the space. And by the place, what I meant was a point in space. It could be an intersection, the surrounding environment of the station platform, the surrounding environment, the immediate environment within the quarter mile of the bus stop, but also the space, which was the two-dimensional area that contains the events, the specific situations, the spatial attributes and characteristics of the particular neighborhood and districts. And the studies collected data both at the place level, the microenvironment, as well as the space level, the larger immediate environment. And just to give you an idea, these were the type of indicators that I measured for the bus stops, factors that facilitated escape, land use factors, the condition of the built environment, the street characteristics, the bus stop characteristics. We had an army of trained graduate students that really measured quite objectively these elements. And as far as the transit stations, again, these were the different types of things that we measured both at the platform as well as the surrounding area, like the park and ride lots. And we don't have much time, but I will tell you some of the variables that were associated with high crime rates included the alleys and mid-block connections near the bus stops, the proximity of liquor stores and other undesirable establishments, the presence of vacant buildings and lots, rundown buildings, and street litter. These were all associated and statistically significant with more crime at the bus stops. Variables associated with low crime had to do with open front retail stores, better visibility and natural surveillance opportunities, the existence of a bus shelter, street traffic, and pedestrian presence. And these are actually two bus stop settings. On the left is a very high crime bus stop in Los Angeles. On the right, a very low crime bus stop. For the stations, variables associated with higher crime rates included the presence of large park and ride lots next to the station, because, again, I was finding that most of the crime was not on the station platform, where there were a number of people, but in the surrounding area. Underpass platforms, poor visibility, the existence of multifamily residential and retail land uses in the vicinity, liquor stores and other undesirable establishments, the presence of graffiti and litter and dilapidated buildings. Variables associated with lower crime rates included the presence of office and industrial land uses, well-kept neighborhoods, and good building stock. And here are some of the unsafe environments where there were stations with high crime, and some of the bars and liquor stores in the vicinity. There were also certain sociodemographic characteristics that related to station crime. Variables with high crime rates included high population density, more persons per household, younger population, and population with less than high school education. Variables associated with lower crime rates included owner-occupied units, higher income households, white neighborhoods, and population which was college educated. Now, these are the particular Los Angeles characteristics. This may be different in other places. This is a map that shows the kind of some visual correlations between crime and population density. And, oops, can we turn it on? Yeah. And crime against persons. We were also looking into different types of crime. All these studies have been published. Whoever is interested, I'm more than happy to send them there quite some time ago. So these were some policy recommendations that came out of these studies for safer bus stops, that the security of transit passengers should extend from the bus stop and the platform to the surrounding public environment, that to move bus stops from desolate places to places with better surveillance opportunities and more foot traffic, to upkeep and maintain the environment, and to conduct regular security audits. We were finding that bus stop crime was highly concentrated. 19% of the crime was happening at only a very small subset of bus stops. About 20 bus stops were concentrating the crime. In terms of safer stations, let's put that again up, secure routes connecting to the station, secure station parking lots with smaller lots instead of larger lots, well-lit lots, better integrated to the urban fabric, increase police patrolling on park and ride lots, and even incorporate maybe some convenience stores and ticket machines with people on the lots. It keeps, yeah. Now, coming to the second part of my talk, it was pretty obvious in the surveys of transit riders that accompanied some of these more observational measurements that a certain subgroup was much more affected, of riders, much more affected than others. And this is actually a quote from a publication by Hamilton and Jenkins that talks about how women have very distinct safety and security needs. And it was very clear that women were much more fearful about transit crime than men. And in a much more recent publication in Town Planning Review, I'm discussing about the gender differences in travel patterns here. You see a table about women in the global north. There are some differences in women in the global south, but these are very specific differences that lead to very specific gender needs. And women are facing more barriers that affect their mobility. Some of these barriers are cultural. Women are mostly perceived as the primary caregivers for children, as well as aging parents. And they are primarily responsible for domestic chores. And the impact on their travel patterns, they take more and shorter trips. Oftentimes, they're accompanied by their children. They oftentimes carry large items during travels, like shopping bags. And they do what we call in transportation planning a lot of trip chaining, a lot of moving from one place to the other. And some of them are also characterized by what they call hypermobility. They have to take their kids everywhere, to the school, to the soccer game, et cetera, et cetera. But also economic barriers. A lot of women, more than men, lack economic resources for private automobiles, which means that they are transit dependent. There are physical barriers. Some of them are related to the automobile-oriented urban form and the sprawl that characterizes a lot of West Coast American cities. The lack of adequate infrastructure for walking, which leads to an over-reliance on private automobiles and long time spent on public transportation. And there are psychological barriers that relate to the fear of harassment and victimization. Sometimes the fear that is instilled on younger women from parents about stranger danger. And this leads to avoidance of public transit, walking and cycling, the avoidance of particular transit settings and routes that we see in a number of our studies that we hear today, traveling only during daytime and traveling only if they're accompanied by others. And women have very particular fear of certain public spaces, and this fear is justified because of these factors that I don't have the time to go into each and every one. And in terms of their physical characteristics of spaces, women are particularly afraid of enclosed spaces with limited exit opportunities, as well as anonymous and deserted open spaces. And these are, again, from a lot of surveys with women that are transit riders. In terms of, they're also fearful of empty parking structures, desolate bus stops, empty train wagons. And this fear and anxiety, as we have heard over and over again in our studies of the recent project with Vanya and the other 16 researchers, leads them to change their behavior. So women's safety needs, a lot of women have told me that they prefer staffing to technological solutions. The fact that there is a CCTV, closed circuit television camera is not particularly helpful for a lot of women, because they say, if I'm victimized, someone may find out about it later, but what is happening now? So the policies that they view positively are request stop programs during late evening hours, taxi cab vouchers for low-income women, real-time information at bus stops, we talked about that earlier, public awareness campaigns, public signs. In the US, at least, segregated transport schemes received mixed results. A study that I did of 131 US transit operators shows, unfortunately, that these concerns of women are not being taken very seriously. Only 1/3 of these agencies believe they should do something specific about women's needs. They're afraid that they're going to be accused of reverse discrimination if they focus on women. Only 3 agencies out of 131 had initiated some programs. Don't have time to go much into that, but it shows this mismatch between what they are doing and what women want. And so I'm going to stop here because I have specific ideas and proposals that fall into these 4 categories: research, design, transport policy, and transport technology. But this is something we are going to talk more explicitly at the end of today as a panel. And so for the interest of time, I'm going to stop here and come back at the end of the day. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we will save possibilities for questions and some discussion when both papers are presented. So now I welcome Professor Mahesh Nalla, and your paper's title in the program is Sexual Harassment in Public Spaces in India. Welcome.
Thank you. I'll try to be as brief as possible given the time limits that I'm working with. My presentation is about a specific case study, sexual harassment in India. Briefly, so I had long-standing interest in violence, particularly corporate violence by multinational companies. So that's how I began my career. And then I shifted to violence within corporations, that is on worker violence on fellow workers, and into domestic violence, and eventually to in public spaces. But public spaces happened in 2012 after this infamous Nirbhaya case. As you saw yesterday, a presentation on that. And so that's how I got into this, looking at violence, but in a very specific areas. So the primary objective is to look at, I focus on offenders. We heard a lot yesterday from the victim's perspective, and today I want to talk a little bit about the offending patterns and self-reported behaviors, and also throw in some comparisons between gender differences in terms of how they perceive the seriousness of the violence, where it happens, and why it occurs. So I went through, listening to a lot of presentations yesterday. I sat up all night trying to change my presentation to make it a little more interesting, because I'm so used to presenting this very technical, conference presentations, where, all the statistics and the methods part. So I try to kind of mix it up to at least to keep you awake in the presentation. Again, I'll quickly run through the slides. Some of the slides you already heard. I don't want to spend too much time. I just want to get to some of the more interesting differences that we found in this research. So, changing role of women in society, but keeping in mind India is a very interesting case study, only apart from being a post-colonial society. And as much as they tout themselves to be the most democratic and the biggest democratic country in the world, the kind of problems that the country faces is just so humongous simply because of the population size. I don't want to go through this particular slide and what constitutes, but we followed the definition that Jagori, an NGO organization, and the UN Women research, which identified certain behaviors as sexual harassment. We also talk briefly about public spaces. The one key thing is, what is public space in India is that the second point, the third point in the slide you see is that from a patriarchal perspective, which India is, if women are not in the house, if they're in public, it means that women are not in the house. So it's a very critical, perspective of how traditionally men view the role of women. So this particular slide, I just wanted to talk about how we define public space and what the literature talks about public space. There's a lot of research in general about sexual harassment in public spaces. These are some examples. And yesterday you saw Vanya's presentation where she talked about comparison of various countries about sexual harassment. In India, there was little work on sexual harassment. There's pre-Nirbhaya era and the post-Nirbhaya era. But again, the kind of research that's done is limited. People are doing it now, but it's in nascent stages. Theoretical contributions we have seen yesterday, as well as in existing literature of gender-related perspectives relating to violence against women. There is the agency, the patriarchy, masculinity perspectives that talk about the violence against women. And from mainstream criminology, and as Anastasia just mentioned about some of the more classical theories relating to why people commit crime, and which is very the Beckerian, Bentham models of the rationality and why human beings engage in behaviors of this nature. But theories that came out of those perspectives, those larger ideological underpinnings, are theories such as the routine activities theory, the learning theories, neutralization theories, and the more recent ones, and some of you I was talking yesterday who'd been to ECHA meetings, very familiar with the situational crime prevention theories that Ron Clark proposed in 1980s, and still it's a very popular classical perspective in criminology. In the corporate sectors, that is the biggest perspective that they go with in trying to deal with problem solving. And those of you who are familiar with Zedner and others in terms of crime governance and pre-crime areas, they all talk about this perspective. Even the Norwegian criminologist Katja Stanko also talks about globalization and how things are changing in the neoliberal democracies in terms of what crime is and how it is defined and how it's controlled. So we did a survey based on items from Jagori, UN Women, and the location is India. And as you can see, I just put a little thing in red, which is where I grew up in India before I went to the US for my studies, doctoral studies. So Delhi is northern part with the red little block there you see. And this is the city of Delhi where my study was done. And this data was collected and some translation was done with the help of my former doctoral student who grew up in Delhi, and he's very familiar with Hindi. I grew up in the South, and my Hindi is smattering, not really fluent. Just some visuals about, when you talk about sexual harassment, I think without a context of how and where and how it looks like, it's difficult. If you take a transit system that Anastasia talked about in Los Angeles, the kind of background may be very different than when you look at Delhi. In Delhi, you can't walk 2 feet without bumping into people. And so that is the density of the population. So you've got to keep sexual harassment in that context. And this is a very normal thing about school kids running back. And even I did the very thing when I was growing up, even though I grew up in a very small city on the coast. It was always, often I traveled just hanging on to just hanging onto the footboard because there are no doors. So you just hang on to your dear life when you go from place to place. This is the metro station, one of the metro stations in Delhi. And so look, this is the office going time, office coming, returning time. So all these are critical factors. Public spaces. You go to a bazaar. This is, I think, in Old Delhi. And again, this is part of during the festive season. This is how they look. Even India Gate, which is a central park, which is supposedly one of the biggest parks in Delhi, you will find a lot of people there. These are some examples of eve teasing. In India, they call it eve teasing for sexual harassment. This is the male perspective. The male word is eve teasing. And normally it takes place in group settings. So you would have 2 or 3 people there. Rarely see one single, individual going out and doing this. So, and the last slide, the fourth one to the right-hand side is a video I don't want to show now, but it's about 2 sisters in a bus beat up the guy who harassed one of the sisters. And the bystanders did nothing. They just watched. And keep in mind, this bus was not that crowded. There are laws against, after Nirbhaya case, there were laws, expanded legal framework for including many behaviors. One of the things I have an issue with this is, and I'm still working on this, is I'm not trained legally, but I'm working with a law scholar to analyze the legal situation, where there's a word they use as outraging a woman's modesty. And I have no idea what that means, to be honest with you. And again, I think I'm a little educated person, but I don't know if I don't have background about legal matters and analysis. I do not know what they think about what modesty is. And so they do spell it out, but again, it's a complex issue, and it's a research project in itself. So it's not no time or format for this analysis. Again, you can see I was burning the candle both ends last night, and I see a spelling error there. This is, again, a slide I created last night to show the differences in crimes against women per 100,000 population. Delhi versus all India to show the comparison of the amount of crimes against women. We did a survey based on the identified characters. We identified 20 different behaviors, and we did a stratified sampling looking at by age, by gender, by social security, social status, and occupation. So these are the 4 categories: non-verbal, verbal, physical less serious, and physical more serious. And these are the 20 behaviors we included in the survey. We trained 20 University of Delhi students with the survey. They're back translated. And these are the demographics. So we chose 55%. We oversampled females slightly more, and males 44%. And these, we also included caste, which I don't know why we did it, but we included that as well, besides the social class. So the findings in general is that the victimization in public spaces, you see they happen in public transit, about 87%, in public areas, 83%, and school work, 31%, and a breakdown of places where victimization occurs. So you see that the taxi, that is a 3-wheeler rickshaws, taxis also, there's a fairly high percentage. But these are not inclusive. This is the incident rate and not necessarily the prevalence rate. We asked about the gender difference. We looked at the gender differences for this, how serious these behaviors are, and as expected, you would find that there will be differences, slight differences. But these differences are statistically significant. That is the difference between males and females. We asked them, why does it happen? And we looked at the gender differences, and there are misperceptions. Actually, there are misperceptions relating to why it occurs. What we did was we looked at global perceptions and then the offender's perception. And you see that there are very marked differences between what people think why it happens in general versus the offenders themselves as to why it happens. And you see, she was not dressed appropriately according to Indian culture, but more like a Westerner. And so you see the big differences. And these are all statistically very, very significant, strong. The T values are very, very high for each one of these items. But again, these are the different categories. Because she was all alone, the police wouldn't have done anything if the women complained. She asked for it since she was wearing revealing clothes. So most of them are victim-blaming issues, but there are differences. There are also differences between victims and self-reported offenders about the nature of these behaviors. So for example, unwanted deliberate pinching, touching towards the end, you see exposing genitals, masturbation in front of the women. All these, you see the differences in various categories. But they, again, they are fairly distinct. We only looked at the strongly agree, strongly agree, and very strongly agree. Why do you engage in sexual harassment? Okay, so we looked at the males. Out of 621 males, we found close to 50% saying, yes, they admitted to having done that. And these are the percentages of people, why they did it. She was alone was the highest, and the last one was agreed to go on a date. So in between, you see that the patriarchy or the agency and cultural stereotypes coming in the way, like, dressed as a Westerners, police wouldn't do anything. And interestingly, she didn't seem married, was also one of the things, and that's an interesting item for us, is that, and again, we can have an entire paper on that, looking at, analyzing that particular one. We also asked, did you do this? Do you know a male friend who has done it? So we wanted to see the difference between personal versus I know a male friend. And you see that they know more people who have done that versus their own. But it also gets into the survey data validity about in terms of how honestly they're responding to these questions. But what we make out of that is that they're doing it in the presence of other friends, even though our data does not capture that. But that's the future research, because that's one of the things in retrospect we feel that we have not included the question, were you alone or with other people when you did this? And which we can draw from qualitative data. So the dependent variable is sexual harassment, is dichotomous, and we had independent variables. We used egalitarian and masculinity gender-based theories for operationalizing our variables, and the mainstream criminological theories of classical rational choice perspectives, including RAT, which is the routine activities theory, which also includes capable, suitable target from SCP, that is situational crime prevention. These are the scales, and they're all, alphas are very high, except for suitable target. It's close to 0.7, which is not bad. And they're all loaded well. And this is the ordinary least square regressions, and you see some support for gender theories of masculinity and education, but no support for situational crime prevention or routine activities theory for the larger audiences. However, we did the analysis without including friend, and we found a direct relationship between a suitable target and no guardianship. They're very significant. But when we included friend into it, the strength of the relationship between these predictive variables disappeared. So which means that we still need to figure out what is happening. Is it the question of operationalization of our variables, or whether the relevance of Western theories to Indian context? So these are, we still need to tease out, but these are, and then you see the 4 columns. We did for everyone, we did for nonverbal, we did for verbal, and we did for physical. But here, I think there's a problem there in terms of what a nonverbal, a verbal, and a physical means. Because the survey questions, yes, in our heads, we're very clear. This is the behavior Jagori and UN used. However, when the people are responding to it, we're not so sure what actually that means to them. So there's, again, this is as a preliminary research, we see that we find some interesting differences. Suitable target is only for physical, but not for nonverbal and verbal. And so we have to do further analysis for that. We also asked people why they did not respond. Again, victim blaming came out to the top one. They said, police, afraid police will trouble me. I was afraid to approach police. People start blaming me for my appearance. Parents advised me not to report. People question my character. It's an everyday thing I'm used to. I'm embarrassed, ashamed, and I'm scared to discuss harassment with everyone. So it's a lot of victim blaming happening. Police legitimacy clearly is not very high, so they don't approach the police. The gender differences are there, but still they're afraid of, they don't have any trust in police. Criminal justice effectiveness, some gender differences, just interesting. Laws are effectively enforced by police and sexual, it's in the negative. So you see that a lot of people don't believe that it is done well. How do we enhance safety for women? There are gender differences, but we talked about various items. Some of them are presented yesterday in terms of the apps to discuss about what can be done to make it more effective. These are all their own responses. How can you make it better or improve the condition? And lastly, what are the next things? We heard many suggestions yesterday, and I don't want to spend on that, but the one thing I want to focus on now, given the limited time, is the curriculum changes in preschool and grade school level. And I think this is a long-range investment. You know, you plant the seed now, because you hope for a generation, you know, that's 15, 20 years from now that may probably capture something. To me, that is one of the key approaches to long-term investment in changing the culture. I'm very familiar with the organizational behavior literature. It happens only in corporations. They can change it in a very small setting. You're talking about 1.3 billion population. And to make change, to bring change, it is not an easy task. It requires a little bit of long-range planning. And the second thing is that Indians are crazy about Bollywood heroes, heroines, and cricket stars. And if they can incorporate and bring them into like media using like every week, like a television series. There was one episode, there was one series by a hero's name, star's name, Salman Khan, I think. And he had a show, and he would talk about social problems every week. I think their services could be, media can work towards bringing these people to kind of spread the message. So I close with those remarks. Thank you.
Fantastic presentations, and I think also a very interesting example of this two very different contexts, but also your different perspectives on one hand, the spatial physical conditions, and in your case also really understanding the people behind what's happening. So I will give you one mic here, and then I will open up, and we'll run a little bit into lunch. I've got the permission to do that, to open up for questions to our two presenters. And do we have a mic that we pass around, Vanya? Or, yeah? Okay, so who wants to? Yes, here we have a question. Okay, I might repeat your question just for the, no. Okay.
You know, so I'm trying to think, like, you know, just based on your experiences in this, how would you think about structuring this particular kind of education effort to young children?
Okay, so I'll just repeat for the sake of the film as well. So the question around really starting early, how does this work with a child's perspective on these issues is, of course, very different from an adult's perspective. So,
Hello?
Is it on mute or is it?
Yes, good question. I mean, you don't talk about sex and sex education at an early age. But I think the underlying premise for me is that considering the girl sitting next to you is equal to you, number one. And number two, that she can be and do what you can do. public space is not just for males, because in India, public space is seen very, very different by males and females. And we heard a lot of that from other research, from other parts of the country in terms of how they view. So the idea at that early stage in preschool and school is to create this environment and making it clear that they are no different than you, because at home, they're receiving messages, oh, you're a boy. You shouldn't be in the kitchen. What are you doing in the kitchen? You should be out there doing something else. But the daughter is in the kitchen. So these messages are very firm and they are entrenched. And if they are not contradicted and challenged in schools, early school system, and that sets the tone. And grade school, yes, in the US, in grade schools, they introduce sex education in a very subtle way. I mean, you know, as an American, you understand where it begins about sex education. So in that sense, my view is that preschool, it's not we don't introduce sexual harassment in preschool, but the idea of respect and equality and fairness and equal sharing of resources is a starting point.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Can I add? I want to say just that it is a starting point, but in the US it's not enough. I mean, there is sexual education, as you say, from very early, but you saw in the Los Angeles example that sexual harassment on transit is quite pervasive. So we really need to talk about also other approaches as well.
And yeah.
We educate them slowly because that's the time they're starting to learn and they're curious about their own body. So there's a way of learning and there's a system how you do it. So the people who are trained to do it actually do that. So that's how we introduce sex education. He rightly said you don't talk about harassment, but if they understand nobody can touch you on your breast because that's your private part, if somebody does it, they know it's wrong. So they can talk about it.
That's just to repeat that you're saying that there are, of course, pedagogical ways of dealing with body integrity and so forth. Yeah. Okay. Another question?
I have a question for Anastasia. So I'm curious whether you've done any research on smart growth and how that may relate to transit safety, in particular, or whether you have any hypotheses.
Smart growth?
Smart growth, yeah.
Okay.
Which kind of, influences mixed designers and
Yes.
and so on.
Yes. Well, smart growth kind of talks for more compact cities. As I mentioned earlier, different types of crime happen under different situations. So typically we found in Los Angeles that the more serious crime, what FBI calls type 1 crime, which is the rape, but also aggravated assault and all that, does not happen in desolate bus stops. So if you have more mixed uses, it's better because there are people around, as you can imagine, more natural surveillance. On the other hand, other types of crime, like pickpockets or snatching, chains and all that, do happen. That's why, if you remember, we did find more crime near retail areas. So it depends on the type of environment. And so in certain cases, smart growth, mixed use are helpful. In others, they may lead to more crime, and that's where you have to start thinking and differentiating, and some of the approaches need to be much more targeted to the particular situation you have.
Okay. More questions? Yes?
The perception of some of the incidents maybe could be that police do nothing. The perception that create pragmatic consequences.
Yes, it's a very valid scientific question. I mean, how do you cross-check this? As I said, this is a perceptual study. So this is their perception and their experiences. And again, we also saw a huge difference between actual perceptions versus behavior. As one of the slides I showed that there's a global perception seemed to be very much exaggerated relative to those of people who actually are engaged in that behavior. So yes, that's point number one. Point number two is that police legitimacy is a serious concern in India. And again, I'm saying legitimacy. I'm using the word legitimacy with a very, very big quotation marks, because honestly, I don't know what that word means in India. If you use legitimacy, honestly, I have no idea what that means. But in the Western world, we use these phrases as if they are applicable across cultures. Mm. It doesn't. It simply doesn't. But I would substitute that word in saying confidence. Or do you trust the police to do something for you if you report? What we see is that we did another study in Delhi. The trust and legitimacy in police is very less. And I compared this with self-reported police officers' behavior who don't trust the people. Part of the problem in India is that in the Western world, as a comparison, you see, if you think about a policeman, he is seen as he's a representative of the community whose job it is to protect the community member. In the US, it happens at a very, very local level. Okay. In India, the police is a representative of the state. You can say a state is people, for people. But in people's heads, from a post-colonial perspective, you have to keep in mind how people think about what police are. Actually, even at this stage, when I'm traveling in India and a policeman stops me, actually I'm afraid. So you have to keep that in perspective as to how people view. I work with a lot of police, by the way, in India. They don't give me a lot of access to the data, but I do work with police because it's a very closed society. You can't have access. But from a scientific perspective, I appreciate your question, but no, this is completely perceptual.
Okay.
That in Los Angeles, believe it or not, also the Latino and African American communities have responded that they really are afraid of the police for different reasons. There is social profiling, particularly of the African American community, and Latino communities are very afraid, a number of them, that they may be deported, especially, unfortunately, under the present administration that you all know, and I don't need to go into. So a lot of them are they would never report to the police, and so you have to start thinking about other. So a number of them have mentioned, for example, in surveys, that if the transit agency has its own, so these are not the policemen, it's not the LAPD, they're the transit agency security guards. Or if you have staffing, people who collect the tickets, there is an additional element that really makes people less afraid and they feel they can go and report. So you really, as a policymaker, you really have to start thinking of these ways, because some of the most vulnerable folks who really are transit dependent are Latinos and African Americans. And if they are not going to report to the police, that's, using police is not very effective.
Okay. No more question. I actually had one thought, or one. I am curious about what in the first presentation here. I understand the terms that were, that there are mentioned of like negative factors. There are liquor stores. There are rundown houses and so forth that are from a pure. Like a perspective, you can see that these are negative factors for crime rates. But how do you reflect on when these phenomena, let's say, are like targeted as negative? On the other hand, a liquor store is part of a community. It's something that takes place. It's like, so how do you reflect on this? Like, when on one hand we can see like correspondence, and of course it's a good preventive measure. We can work with that as a method. but that it also gets this negative value. For example, one could take a more radical example is that, you know, certain people are sort of threatening, but when they get labeled as negative presence, it's a very tough. It's not. It would be interesting to hear your reflection on that.
Yeah, I understand your point that you know you're stigmatizing certain. Well, all I was reporting and finding is that the exact location of a bus stop next to a liquor store, statistically, at least in my sample, was leading to more crime. And all you're saying is not to close the liquor store, but move the bus stop 2 feet away so that it is in a more, a better surveyed location. It is not, so you can move the bus stop up or down. It is not necessary to have it extremely next to the liquor store.
And then, of course, it gets more difficult or tricky when it's relating to certain groups of people and so forth, how you engage with it. But
yes, absolutely. And you do find more crime near areas where you have younger people. Does this mean that we have to be absolutely not?
No, exactly.
But it is good to know some of these things because you really, it may lead to different types of interventions. You may have more staff in an area, and especially you know that crime peaks when the school, you know, at the end of the school hours. So you may want to have more staff around to prevent certain things, to prevent harassment. So it's good to know these things, but I agree with you. There is a danger sometimes to kind of stigmatize people and places.
Okay, thank you. Okay, you wanted to have also a final commentary.
Yes, I just want to thank Vanya for her kind invitation to be here, and to KDH for your hospitality, for keeping us well-fed, well-caffeinated, and well-hydrated. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay.